Hello and welcome to today's PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. If you're joining us live, please remember that you can ask questions anytime throughout the webinar by clicking Q&A near the bottom of your screen. I will relay these questions to our guest a little bit later on, so you can put them through whenever they pop into your head and know that that is not going to be disruptive, so no need to wait. And if you include your name, your school, or your city, I'd love to give you a shout out when I ask your question. We are joined today by Dr. Andrew Lentini. He is the Interim Director of Conservation and Wildlife at the Toronto Zoo. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Lentini. I will let you take it away.
All right, it's a great pleasure to be here. I will share my screen with you, and we will start the presentation. There we go. So my name is Andrew Lentini, as you've heard. I've been with the zoo for a very long time, almost 33 years now, and I've worked with everything from grizzly bears to orangutans over the years. But I have specialized primarily in reptiles and amphibians for most of my career here. And what I'd like to talk to you about today are snakes. They're really one of my favorite group of animals. They're quite unique, quite special. And I'd just like to share that with you. And if you've got questions afterwards, I'm more than happy to answer those for you if I can. So we've all heard the expression of cold-blooded, and snakes are often referred to as cold-blooded. But that's not quite correct. Snakes are actually called ectothermic. And what that means is that they get their body heat from their environment, from outside of their own bodies. We generate heat internally. That's why we eat 3 meals a day. We burn off all those calories to keep our bodies at 37 degrees. Snakes still need that warmth because many of their systems are very similar to ours. They need warm enzymes to digest their food, to make their antibodies work, to fight off infections, etc. So they have very similar structures and functions that we have. So they maintain their body heat by basking in the sun. They'll warm themselves up so their bodies are usually in the high 20s or low 30s. And that way they can carry on life as a snake would. And when we look at them a little more closely and we look at their anatomy, we see that they have a lot of the same internal structures that we do, and a lot of people are surprised by this. Snakes have a heart just like you and I do. They have paired organs, a pair of lungs, a pair of kidneys, etc. So they're really not that different than us when you take a close look. You know, from the outside you see this big long animal with no legs, and it looks very odd. But really they are a vertebrate just like we are, and they have the same structures. And when you talk about vertebrates, that group of animals is defined by the fact that they have a backbone or vertebrae. Each of those bones is called a vertebra. And snakes are the ultimate vertebrate. They have an incredibly long backbone, and they have without a doubt, actually, they have the largest number of vertebrae, individual backbones of any vertebrate on the planet. Some of them have well over 350 individual vertebrae. So they are pretty neat animals. And so where did the snakes come from? So this is, again, a fairly large group of animals. They belong to a family of reptiles called squamates. And the squamates are really defined by the structure of their jaws. And there are over 10,000 species, and more than 3,000 of those are snakes. So it's a large group of animals. And these animals evolved anywhere from 90 to 167 million years ago. So they've been around for a long time. And the ancestral animals that gave rise to the squamates, so the lizards and the snakes, were likely mesosaurs, which were the large aquatic reptiles that were around at the same time as the dinosaurs. And these guys are common ancestor to the varanid lizards, which are monitored lizards like our Komodo dragons, and to modern snakes as well. So that's evolutionarily where these animals came from. And when we look at them, yes, they're in the same family as lizards, but they are different. And it's not just the legs that make them different. Because when you look at a lizard, most of them do have legs, but there are legless lizards. The image on the of the legless lizard there, that circle actually highlights the ear of that lizard. And external ears are a feature of most lizards, and so are eyelids. But when you look at a snake, they lack both of those. So snakes do not have external ears. They don't have an external ear opening, so they don't hear quite as well as most animals. And they don't have an eyelid, so they don't close their eyes. Their eye is still protected because they have a clear scale over it, so it's not harmed and it keeps it moist, but they can't close their eyes, so you'll never see a snake blink. Whereas a legless lizard, you'll see it blink from time to time, and they do have that external ear opening. And when we look at the hearing structure for snakes, the inner bones of our ears, have some similarities to those of snakes, but what's happened is that there is this little bone here. If I can get my mouse to point at it, right here, there's this little bone here, and that actually extends from the back of the jaw, so it's attached to the jawbone, and it connects to the inner ear of the snake. And that allows the snake to hear vibrations, usually through the ground or through its body. So they don't hear airborne sounds very well, but they can certainly pick up vibrations, and they can hear ground-borne sounds. So somebody or an animal stepping close by them, or a person stepping close by them, they will actually hear those vibrations using that bone that connects to the inner ear. And where do these snakes live? Now, it's, again, it's close to 3,600 species of snakes, so they live all over the planet. They exploit all sorts of different habitats. We have those that are arboreal, which means that they're living in trees, and they spend really their entire lives up in the trees. They rarely, if ever, come to the ground. They nest up there, they feed up there, they do their entire life up there. There are others that spend all their time on the ground. That's a little garter snake, and these are native here around southern Ontario, where we are here at the Toronto Zoo. And these guys are strictly terrestrial, so they're always on the ground. There are also snakes that are referred to as fossorial, and these are animals that burrow. These animals will live in tunnels, go underground. And this is a patch-nosed snake, and you can see that it has a specialized shield on the front of its face here, on the nose, and that helps them burrow into the ground and through the ground. And then there are other species that are completely aquatic. And these can be marine, like this is a sea krait. So this is a venomous snake that lives entirely in the ocean. But they can also be freshwater, and we have water snakes here in southern Ontario as well. And there are other species that spend almost all of their time in the water. And how do they eat? This is one of the most fascinating parts of snakes. And this is where the special structures of their skull come into play. Because snakes, they consume the widest range of prey of any other group of carnivores. So these guys are carnivores, which means they eat animal protein. And they start from the very smallest animals, like invertebrates. And here we have a video of a snake actually eating a snail. And what I'd like you to see when I play this, I'd like you to have a look and just watch the way the snake's head is moving while it's feeding. And you'll actually be able to see the different structures, the different bones in the head moving independently under the skin. So I'm just going to play this now for you. And the snake uses its vision to focus in on its prey, and then it uses its jaw to secure it and grab it. And you can see how the bones under the skin in the jaw, that's actually the lower jaw that's moving, and it moves each side independently. And that's how these animals are able to swallow large prey, because they can actually manipulate it down into their throats using their jaw instead of using their hands like we would. We actually, we use utensils, or we grab a hamburger, hold it in our hands, and take bites. But these guys take an entire meal whole, and they can do that without the help of hands. They also eat fish, and as I said, there's a number of snakes that live almost entirely in the water. These are the aquatic species, and this is a water snake, and we have these in southern Ontario, and they're very good at catching and swallowing slippery fish, and slippery, in some cases, even slippery amphibians. So some of these do specialize on feeding on frogs. This is a green snake eating a frog, but there's also others that specialize in eating salamanders, others that specialize in eating toads. So they will eat a variety of amphibians. And there are other snakes that specialize in eating other reptiles. So there are some that feed on lizards, and there are some, like the king cobra in this photo, that are specialized snake eaters. So they'll actually eat other snakes. There are also snake species that will feed on turtles, will feed on turtle eggs. So really a wide variety of diets that these animals can exploit. And they will feed on birds and even on eggs. And this is a photo or an image here, a video of a gopher snake eating an egg. This is a snake that got into a chicken coop and started eating the bird's eggs. So you can see how wide they can extend their jaw, and they just can eat an incredibly large meal compared to the size of their head, the size of their jaw. So you can see that animal got it right down. And they also eat, obviously, mammals, and these are the ones that maybe more of us are familiar with. We're all used to seeing somebody's pet snake or a snake in a pet store eating a mouse, but they can take very large animals too. So this is one of the large constrictors. Boa constrictors and pythons are the biggest, the heaviest of the snakes, and this one is eating actually a small deer. So they can have incredibly large meals, and one of the benefits of this is that they can get by on very few meals a year. Sometimes as few as 10 meals a year will sustain a snake. And they do this because they don't need the same calories that we do. As I said at the beginning, we're warm-blooded or endotherm, so we're burning calories all the time to fuel that little furnace we have inside of us to keep our body temperatures at 37 degrees. Snakes don't need to do that. They get their heat from the environment, so they get by on a lot less food, a lot less energy than birds and mammals do. And they do that, they can eat these large meals because of the special structures of the jaw. So if you look at this image of a skeleton, of a jaw of the skull, you'll see that all the teeth point backwards into the mouth, and that's how they can secure a meal that doesn't get away from them, and they can pull it back into their mouths. And the jaw is incredibly flexible. Like ours is more or less fused at the front. We have a hard chin bone, and then the angle of the jaw where it connects to our head, our skull, is actually pretty tight. We can move our jaws up and down a little bit sideways, but that's about all. With snakes, though, none of those joints are fused, so they have incredible flexibility, and they can move the lower mandibles, so the bones on each side of the lower jaw, independently. So they can reach forward with one and reach forward with the other and keep pulling the meal down their throat. And they also have teeth in the upper jaw, plates of teeth in the upper jaw that can move independently as well, and that helps them pull food down into their throats. And when you saw that photo of the snail, or the video of the snail being eaten, you could see the way that jaw was moving when the snake was feeding. And another really interesting thing is that they can fill their entire mouth with these large meals but still breathe. And they can do that because you can see in the photo of the snake here with its mouth open that you see a small little hole there at the bottom, and that's actually the trachea. So that's the glottis, which is the opening to their windpipe. And they can extend that out underneath whatever they're eating and keep breathing. It's almost like a snorkel that allows them to keep breathing while they're feeding. So they're really, really incredibly evolved and adapted to taking these large meals without the use of hands, and they can go a long time on a single meal. So when they catch their food, some of these guys are ambush predators, which means they sit and wait. Others are foragers, and others pursue their prey. And they catch their prey either typically by constriction, which means that they squeeze the animal until it can't breathe anymore, and that way they can safely swallow it after it's been killed, or they use venom. And venom is another really interesting thing. What we have in this image here is this is a video of a Gaboon Viper. It's not the clearest, but it'll show you what's happening. And Gaboon Vipers are, oh, I'm sorry, that didn't go where it should have. And Gaboon Vipers, if I can get my thing back, here it is. Gaboon Vipers are ambush predators, so they sit very still, wait for prey to come to them, and then they snap out very, very quickly, lightning fast actually, and they grab their prey. So you can see how quickly this really large snake that looks like it should be kind of slow moving is actually lightning fast, and when he grabs that small rat, it's in a blink of an eye. He grabs it incredibly quickly. So that's an ambush predator, and that's what these animals are specialized in doing. Now, those venoms are really pretty impressive biological substances. They're made of a number of different things. They have toxins, they have enzymes, and it is a true venom, which means that it's injected into the prey. It's very different than a poison. A poison is something that would have to be ingested, which means you eat it. But venoms are injected, so they go through a delivery mechanism, in this case either a fang or a stinger on a wasp or on a stingray. But venomous snakes all have these specialized fangs, hollow fangs, for delivering the venom. And when we look at them, they are pretty impressive. They allow snakes to very safely incapacitate prey that can be quite large, can be quite dangerous for them, and allows them to safely incapacitate that prey so that they can eat it. And they also help start digestion, because those enzymes start to break down the meal before the snake even eats it. Now, venoms make them fascinating. They really get me. I'm actually so intrigued by what venoms do and what they allow snakes to do, but they're also pretty dangerous, and that's when people really have to be careful around some snakes. And again, of the more than 3,600 species of snakes out there, there's only maybe a few hundred that are dangerous to people because they are venomous. And snakes can use that venom to defend themselves. So if they feel threatened, if they're frightened, if they think they're going to be preyed on, they will strike out, and they can actually inject venom into people. So these animals can be very dangerous, and they definitely do not make good pets. And with most exotic species, the trade in these animals in the pet market, it's usually illegal. And it causes a number of problems. One of the biggest is for actually the animals themselves, because many of them are trafficked illegally, and they're kept in inhumane conditions and treated badly, and a lot of them suffer a really, really poor quality of life, if they have any quality of life at all. And it also can threaten species. In some cases, we were involved in the rescue of a number of Massasauga rattlesnakes, which are Ontario's only venomous species, that were actually taken from the wild, and they were being sold illegally. So we were actually able to help rescue those animals and then return them to the wild. But the illegal pet trade is actually quite dangerous for the animals, but also for people. So I was called upon just last year to respond to a bite from a cobra here in Ontario, here in Toronto. And it was a person who was dealing with a cobra, which is an illegal animal to be kept in the city, and he was bitten by it. And he was very, very sick, and quite honestly, he could have died from a bite like this. So these are not good pets. These, exotic species, they're great to admire, and if you're lucky enough to experience them in the wild, that's great, or if you see them in a zoo, that's fantastic. But these certainly are not animals that should be kept as pets, as fascinating as they are. So I'm going to wrap up with that, and I will close this window, and we can talk further if you have questions.
Well, thank you very much. And as you might expect, I've been busy queuing up lots of questions from our audience, lots of curiosities about snakes in particular. So first, I'd like to just go back to you don't have to share the slide, but what you were talking about on your last slide. I know it's probably tough for you to say about yourself, but I get to say that you've been awarded the Urban Hero Award for your work in that situation you described, the snake bite from the exotic pet. But can you let us know a little bit more about what happened there?
Yes, it was a night like any other in my life, but I was just getting home from actually the TFC, the soccer game, and I was driving with a friend, and I was called by the Toronto Zoo security. It was about 9:30 at night, And our security had been contacted by the Ontario Poison Control Center here in Ontario, in Toronto, that actually consults and deals with all types of poisoning, including envenomations by exotic species. And they put me in touch with the hospital where the patient had been admitted, and I very quickly came to the understanding that this young man had been bitten by a cobra and needed our anti-venom from the zoo. We keep anti-venom here, which is really the only treatment available for a venomous bite. So we keep anti-venom here at the zoo for a number of species to safeguard our staff. Our keepers work with venomous species all the time. We're very careful with it, but just in case there is an accident, we keep the anti-venom here. So we were able to share the anti-venom with the hospital, and the young man was treated successfully and recovered, which was a good ending for everybody.
Right. And so we have a question from St. Padre Pio Catholic School wondering, if a person gets bitten by a venomous snake, what should they do?
Well, you should don't panic, because that's not going to help anybody. If you're at Padre Pio, you're here in southern Ontario, so the only real venomous snake you could ever encounter would be up around Georgian Bay, and that would be a Massasauga rattlesnake. And bites from those animals are extremely rare. It's usually, less than 10 bites a year happen, even though there are hundreds of thousands of people who go up around Georgian Bay, and they're in areas where Massasauga rattlesnakes are found. But these snakes are small. When they do bite you, the best thing to do is just get to a hospital. So you would call 911 and you'd wait for an ambulance and you'd go to the hospital. Once you're at the hospital, the physicians will assess you, the doctors will assess you, and if they need to, they will give you anti-venom. Now, I say if they need to, because sometimes snakes can choose whether or not they inject venom. If they're biting because they're trying to defend themselves, sometimes they don't even inject venom. So in cases like that, the hospital would check you out and they would determine whether or not you had symptoms of an envenomation, and then they would treat you appropriately. So, don't panic. Try not to move around too much. You don't want the venom, if you have been envenomated, to spread very quickly, and then get treatment from a hospital.
Wonderful. And we had a really specific question come in from the grade 6s and 7s in Ridgetown, wondering what the pink folds by the fangs are called. They were really well visible in your slide there.
Yes, they are. Those are actually fang sheaths. So it's the equivalent of our gums. So it's just tissue inside the mouth that covers the fangs. Now, in the image of the Gaboon Viper, which has the largest fangs of any venomous species, you can see them very, very clearly. But what's really interesting about Gaboon Vipers is that those long fangs are actually folded in the roof of the mouth, so that they're not always visible unless the snake is preparing to bite and envenomate. So the fang sheaths actually cover the fangs when the mouth is closed and you can't even see them. And then when they extend them, you'll actually see the sheath hanging, just covering the base of the fangs.
Wonderful. Now, we had lots of questions come in about snakes eating. So
Yes.
I'll run through a few of those for you. The first one is from... I'm just scrolling here to find it, from the grade 6 and 7s at Ridgetown again. When the snake eats the egg, does it hurt its spine?
No, the very, very flexible skin around the jaw and in the throat expands completely to accommodate that large, in this case, the large egg. It could be a large rat or a rabbit, who knows what it's going to eat. But it's always the skin that expands, not the spine. So there's no pressure on the spine from that.
And you just answered the other question that we had, was specific to the spine. I think everyone was picturing those ribs trying to expand, but
and they can. They're very flexible, and you could see how the skin really expanded on the throat of that animal when it was swallowing the egg.
And we have a question now from Ms. Green's class at St. Nicholas. They are wondering how long it would take to digest a frog, or maybe something of that similar size.
Yeah, it depends on temperature. Again, remember we were talking about snakes being cold-blooded, but they need to warm their bodies up so that their digestive enzymes work just like ours do. They work just as well as ours. So if a snake can can raise its body temperature, and that's referred to as thermoregulation. So it's regulating its temperature. So thermoregulation. If a snake can thermoregulate and get its body up to its optimum temperature so everything works, it can digest a meal like a frog in probably in 2 or 3 days at the most. However, if it's a cold, cloudy week and the snake is not thermoregulating very well, it could take up to a week to digest that meal. It really is temperature dependent.
And what about those snakes that were eating very large animals like once a month? Mm-hmm. How long does it take them to digest typically?
Yeah, a big meal like that can take a week to 10 days to digest. It's a long time. And what's really fascinating about the constrictors, the pythons in particular, is that their digestive system actually shrinks and shuts down when they're not feeding, so that they're not using a lot of energy on their digestive system. But when they eat that big meal, their digestive system actually grows. They get more blood flow to it, and it focuses on digesting, and that's really all the snake does for that week while it's trying to digest those big meals.
Wow. And a question now from the grade 6s at James Strath Public School in Peterborough, wondering if there's a maximum size a snake can open its jaws.
That's a good question. I have seen I've seen snakes more than triple the size of their girth, their width. But honestly, when you see some of these photos of large African pythons, like the rock pythons, swallowing antelope, it's incredible. They can, there's almost no limit. The jaw isn't the limiting part. It's really the skin that holds the throat and the rest of the jaw together. So it really depends on how far they can stretch that skin.
Right. So next, a question from the grade 6s and 7s at St. Joseph Corona, wondering if you've ever been bitten by a snake before.
I've been bitten by snakes, but never by a venomous snake. So, I've handled a lot of animals over the years. And when you're handling non-venomous animals, sometimes, one of them, you do something that upsets the animal or startles it, and they'll nip at you. So I've had a few little bites from some snakes, but nothing serious.
And we have a question from St. John Fisher. They're wondering, how many babies can a snake have at once?
Great question. Some snakes actually lay eggs and some give birth to live young. So it really depends on the species. Some are very prolific, which means they can produce a lot of eggs. Like a Gaboon Viper can produce enormous clutches of eggs, 30, 40, 50 eggs at a time. Same thing with some of the larger constricting snakes. Can have large litters of live young. They'll give birth to live young. Jamaican boas, we have them here, and we bred them recently, but those have been documented to give birth to over 40 babies at a time. So some of them can have really large litters.
And so they have eggs, obviously, and how long typically before those eggs hatch?
Again, it depends on the species, and snakes don't normally look after their eggs. Most of the common snakes that we have here in Ontario, things like milk snakes, will lay their eggs in a nest and then just leave it, and they cover it. It's in a secure area, and the eggs incubate without mom present. But in some cases, like the pythons, they're actually quite well known for guarding their eggs. They'll coil up around them and they'll protect them. In some cases, an incubation period for an egg could be as short as maybe 70 days, 75 days, but it can be well over 100. It really depends on the species.
Right. So shifting gears a little bit here, still snakes, lots of questions still coming in. We have a question from Mr. Simeonakis' class wondering, how does a rattlesnake's rattle work?
Great question. The rattle is actually made of keratin, so it's the same material as your fingernails. And what happens is that each time a snake sheds its skin, a rattlesnake sheds its skin, a new segment of the rattle is exposed. And what a segment is just a hollow, it's almost not quite cone shaped, but very close. So it's this hollow cone of keratin. And if you can picture this as being one segment, the other segment actually locks in above it, but they're not tight so that they can move within each other. so that when the snake starts to vibrate its tail, those pieces bump into each other, and that sound that they make is what the rattle is. And the neat thing is that they don't actually shake the tail, they actually vibrate it. And it vibrates at about 30 hertz, which is 30 times a second. That's how quickly they're vibrating that tail. And when they have multiple segments together, percussing against each other or hitting each other, they make that distinctive buzzing sound, that rattle sound.
Right. And we have another venom question here from Ms. Kondo's class, wondering, how does venom immunity work?
That's kind of a theory. Venom immunity has been suggested as almost as a vaccine for dogs, for pets. There are some individuals, some people who have actually injected themselves with small amounts of venom, hoping to build up an immunity to it. Theoretically, that's possible, but it's not. It wouldn't make a difference if you were bitten by a snake and you had gone through some kind of immune therapy trying to develop immunity to it. You'd still end up in the hospital, and you'd still be very sick. So when they make antivenom, this is related, because to make antivenom, they're actually injecting small amounts of venom into large animals, typically horses. And what happens is that all those proteins in the venom cause the horse to develop antibodies against those, because they're foreign to the horse, and the horse's body develops antibodies to fight that off, to get rid of it. And it's those antibodies that are eventually harvested and purified, and those are used as anti-venom. So, antibodies to venom are certainly can be produced and are produced, but you can't really make yourself immune to venom. It's just not, it's not practical.
Right. So we have a question that I see has come in from numerous classrooms, so I want to make sure we get to that. It is sort of wondering about how large can snakes get, or what is the largest snake in the world?
There are two answers to that. So there's the heaviest snake in the world, and there's the longest snake in the world. So they're two different species. So the reticulated python is the longest snake in the world, and that one can grow up to 10 meters or longer. The record, I think, is just over 10 meters, so that's a massive, massive animal. We have two reticulated pythons here at the Toronto Zoo. Our female is about 18 years old now. Her name is Fifi, and Fifi is about 19 feet long, so that's close to 7 meters. So she's a big snake as well, and she's probably going to grow some more as she gets older. The heaviest snake in the world is the anaconda. So anacondas are a primarily aquatic species, so they grow quite large, not quite as long as reticulated pythons, but they will be much heavier. So it's a much thicker bodied animal, and that's probably one of the reasons is that it lives in the water, so it's quite buoyant, and it doesn't have to carry all that weight around on land.
Right. And Mr. Rock's class in southwestern Ontario is wondering how long can a snake keep moving for? And we had another class that was asking, how far can a snake travel?
Based on our experiences with some local species here in Ontario, we know that they're capable of traveling great distances. Actually, when you imagine a small snake moving, maybe 6 or 7 kilometers in a season, that's a fair distance for a snake. And even swimmers, some of these are really, really good swimmers, and you'll get things like fox snakes here in Ontario that will swim several kilometers from island to island in Georgian Bay. So these animals can travel a fair distance. They're not necessarily sedentary. They move around quite a bit.
So I can see that we are almost out of time. There are so many questions here. We're never going to be able to get to all of them. I'm so sorry. I hope we've gotten to a question from nearly every classroom. But in that vein, I'd like to ask one from Ms. Davies' class. They're shifting gears a little. What they're wondering about is what it's like to work at the zoo. So is it hard to feed the animals at the zoo? Some animals are a bit of a challenge. Many of you know that we had giant pandas here for a number of years, and we had a couple of babies born here. And specialized
animals like that that feed almost exclusively on one species of bamboo or several species of bamboo can be difficult to feed because you don't have many alternatives. With snakes, though, we're pretty lucky. As I said before, they'll feed on such a wide variety of prey items, everything from invertebrates to mammals, that we can usually find something that they like to eat. And most of our snakes here very readily accept rodents as a meal. And all of our rodents are previously frozen. We simply thaw them out in the refrigerator overnight and warm them up a little bit and then offer them to our snakes, and they're quite happy to eat those. So, we do okay here. Our snakes are generally a very happy lot of animals, and they typically eat quite well.
Well, I never knew that snakes had frozen dinners, just like
Yes,
some humans. Yes, sometimes. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the zoo before we end for today.
Sure.
There is some controversy, depending on who you speak to, about how they feel about zoos, whether it's entirely positive or a mixed bag or negative. What can you tell us from your point of view? Why would zoos be important? What is the benefit to having a zoo like the Toronto Zoo?
And I think there are many different types of zoos, and that's what's important to remember. So the Toronto Zoo is an accredited zoo, which means that we're at the top of the industry. So we meet and exceed all standards for animal welfare and animal care. We have dedicated nutritionists, veterinarians, our keeping staff, our wildlife care staff are exceptional, and they do everything they can to ensure that our animals have the best possible life here at the zoo. And the other thing to remember is that the Toronto Zoo is actually a conservation organization. So we participate in a number of projects and programs where we're actually saving species, not just here at the zoo, but in the wild. So when you're supporting a zoo like the Toronto Zoo, an accredited zoo, you're actually supporting conservation, and we're making a difference to save animals out there. One of the projects that I'm quite proud of is our Blandings turtle Headstart project here in Toronto. And we're actually headstarting eggs that are from nests that would be destroyed or killed. And we're saving these eggs and raising the babies for 2 years in a protected environment here at the zoo, and then returning them to the wild. So that's just one of the examples of the good work that accredited zoos can do. So yes, we all want to see animals in the wild, but the reality is today that the wild isn't really there anymore. You look at the deforestation that's happening across the planet, and you just realize that without zoos, a number of these species would disappear. And we're saving species every day here at the Toronto Zoo.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I imagine we have some people in our audience today who might be interested in pursuing a career or research in the area of conservation, or maybe entirely on snakes after today's presentation.
That'd be great.
Do you have any advice for them? Maybe tell a little bit about how you got to this position you're in now, and what they could do if they're interested.
Sure. I was always fascinated by wildlife, and when I started here at the zoo, I was actually still a student. I was at the University of Toronto studying biology and zoology, and I started here in our education department because Toronto Zoo has some great education programs here too, and that was my summer job. And since then, I've worked as a zookeeper. I've worked as a specialist in reptiles and amphibians, and now I'm heading our division in conservation and wildlife. So my career path here has been pretty long, but I think if you've got if you've got a passion for wildlife, and you have an interest in zoology or in biology, I think learning as much as you can about animals and about biology is a great start to a career in conservation, working specifically with wildlife in a setting like the Toronto Zoo.
Well, thank you so much for everything you shared with us today. That is unfortunately all the time we have, and I may have gone a little over time already anyway, so thank you to everyone who stuck with us a little bit longer today than usual. And of course, our biggest thank you to you, Dr. Lentini, for spending time with us today.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And just to let you know, next up on PIR Live Event, we are learning about the magic of math, male and female curiosities in the animal kingdom, and dark matter. So lots of different things going on. You can find more information about these and other educational programs at pirweb.org. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. We'll see you next time.